Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Sepideh, for the invitation, and it's nice to see some familiar faces again. And uh, this is an experiment for me. I haven't tried this format before. We wanted to keep it informal, so which means I haven't, I just kind of put some slides together, but it's not really too organized, and that's the way it should be, I guess, because I'd like to get some interaction out of you. And yeah, so I was asked to say a little bit about myself. First of all, I'm Alexander Wilson. I'm a philosopher, and I used to be known as an artist or as a musician, a kind of electronic musician, and noise and experimental music. And I was also a theater director for quite a while. I had a small theater company in Montreal. And but slowly as I got older, got deeper into philosophy, and even in philosophy, I've also bifurcated quite a bit, because I used to come from a very kind of continental perspective, and deeply invested in Deleuzian thought, and so yeah, and in recent years I've been, I guess my interests in engineering and technology and science have kind of collided with my philosophical interests, and so recently I've been kind of um, getting deeper into logic, and especially linear logic, and trying to figure out how trying to figure it out, first of all, because it's quite a lot to wrap one's head around. It's not the most intuitive topic. And what is more intuitive for me is the evolutionary part, and so that I've been working. That's been a kind of big part of my work in the past, and so I'm still kind of interested in these questions. Yeah, I'm not a logician but I am trying to figure these things out. So you don't have to be, I'm learning just as much as you are. So please do interact. And so the way I'll do this is I just have some slides. We're going to start with the origin of life, for which I gave you the two last chapters of that book, which is actually interesting how they don't even put a conclusion to the book. There's no kind of wrap up of the kind of big ideas. They just end with that chapter there, the chapter on language, which is kind of annoying, because you want a little bit more kind of conceptualization of what these major transitions in evolution are, which is what the topic of the book is. And so they give this table at the beginning of the book. So right now I prepared some slides that give you an idea of what comes before the two chapters I gave you, like in the beginning of the first part of the book. And so these are the major transitions according to them. They give this kind of list keeps shifting over time. They started this work in the first work, the kind of major transitions book, was in 95 or 96, and then this kind of, the book I shared with you is more of a popular rewrite of the book, like a popular science rewrite of the book. Although the two chapters I gave you, not much had changed, and it's kind of, it was just a little bit updated, and the language is a bit better, but it's not that those two chapters in the original book are more technical or anything. So they talk about these major transitions in evolution, where there are major changes in the way that evolution happens. The substrates, the substances that are used, the code, the kind of replicating, the template replication or whatnot, that the mode of replication changes, and the structure changes, and the kind of there's shifts in how efficient this system is at varying or stabilizing or producing stable output or producing more variation, and we'll get to that. So they list these ones. We'll go through a bunch of them right now. So what are these major characteristics of life? First of all, multiplication implies that one individual can produce two. Heredity requires that there are different kinds of individuals, A, B, and so on, and that individuals produce offspring like themselves. Variation requires that heredity is not perfect, so that occasionally, for example, an A gives rise to a C, as shown. Given these three properties and an appropriate environment, evolution by natural selection will produce organisms with the other characteristics typical of living things, such as metabolism. And then before there can be heredity, there must be reproduction. And before that, there must be growth. The essence of growth is autocatalysis, which is a chemical process. The autocatalytic process is where a chemical compound A undergoes a series of transformations from A to B to C to D, where it's changing state. And the crucial feature is that the last member of that process, say D in this case, produces two molecules of A, such that it produces its own catalyst. It's autocatalytic. So thus each A molecule is the starting point of a new cycle leading to a new D, and so on. So the idea is that before life proper got started, there were chemical reactions on the early surface of the Earth that were just by chance, these chemicals got together, and these reactions started looping back on themselves and repeating their own, growing and repeating their own kind of template for the reproduction of their structure. This is what we typically now know as the kind of genetic replication, homologous base pairing and replication. In DNA, there are 4 kinds of base: A, C, G, and T. And in RNA, the T is replaced with U. But these are just molecules, nucleotides. And so in the two-stranded molecule on the left side of this diagram, the A's pair with T, and the G pairs with C, and it's the specificity of this pairing that is the basis of heredity and hence of all life. When the molecule replicates, the two strands separate, as shown, and the two new molecules, each identical to the original one, are formed by the following pairing rules. So everyone's clear on that, right? That's everyone knows that at this point, I think. They show some helpful statistics about how many genes are active in different organisms, and sometimes interesting to see that the kind of genetic code is the coding genes are not necessarily like what you'd expect. For example, in humans, between 60,000 and 80,000 genes, but in fish, you have between 50,000 and 100,000, and in some plants and whatnot, you have even more. So you have, it's not like it's not only the genetics and the quantity of genes that accounts for the, let's say, complexity of the behaviors and the structures that we encounter. So they say the easiest way to explain what we're talking about in terms of major transitions is to just give you some examples. Replicating molecules, these first autocatalytic chemical reactions, first then kind of the first transition was from these chemicals to a population of molecules in compartments. We think that the first objects with the properties of multiplication, variation, and heredity were replicating molecules similar to RNA, but perhaps simpler, capable of replication but not informational because they did not specify other structures. If evolution was to proceed further, it was necessary that different kinds of replicating molecules should cooperate, each producing effects helping the replication of others. We argue that if this was to happen, populations of molecules had to be enclosed within some kind of membrane or compartment. And this is what we know from the lab. This has been produced now for 45 years or so. This kind of, we know that we can just put RNA into a test tube, and with the proper conditions, the replication just happens. So evolution in a test tube. The initial tube contains the 4 nucleotides from which RNA is synthesized, a replicase enzyme that copies RNA, and a primer RNA molecule. This primer molecule is copied many times with some errors. After incubation for time t, a drop of solution is transferred to the new tube containing nucleotides and enzyme, but not, of course, any primer. So the process just continues from where it left off. And the process of incubation and transfer can be repeated indefinitely, and evolutionary changes in the population of the RNA molecules can be observed. This is a model of one of these RNA molecules that evolved in the test tube. An important thing about at this level of transitions is what Manfred Eigen and Peter Schuster called the error threshold. It has to do with the mutation rate. So if the genome size or the mutation rate per symbol rises above a critical upper limit, the result is an accumulation of mutated messages. That is why Eigen and Schuster have called that is what Eigen and Schuster have called the error threshold. It is easy to see roughly where this upper limit lies. The requirement is that at least one perfect copy on average must be made at each replication. If there are n symbols, this means approximately that the probability of an error when replicating a symbol must not be greater than 1 over n. In other words, if the genome contains 1,000 bases, the mutation rate per base per replication must not be greater than 1 in 1,000. And you can invert that reasoning and make some predictions about, if we know the population of a species, let's say, you can kind of you can estimate, you can guess that the the rate of mutation wasn't higher than a certain amount per population. So the second example they give us is independent replicators transitioned to chromosomal life. In existing organisms, replicating molecules or genes are linked together end to end to form chromosomes, a single chromosome per cell in most simple organisms. This has the effect that when one gene is replicated, all of them are. The coordinated replication prevents competition between genes within a compartment and forces cooperation on them. They are all in the same boat. They discussed that in chapter 5. And so this is another innovation by Manfred Eigen and Peter Schuster. This related to the error threshold is the hypercycle, as which it gives us a model for cooperation in biology, where because the idea is that the autocatalysis might not have been just a single molecule, but it could be several kind of chemical processes that all together form an autocatalytic group. And so they say what is true of present-day ecosystems was definitely true of primitive ecosystems composed of replicating molecules. There was no general reason why particular replicators should evolve characteristics favoring the survival of the whole, and no reason to expect cooperative rather than competitive interactions. Of course, some cooperative interactions would arise by chance. Manfred Eigen and Peter Schuster have argued for the importance of one particular type of cooperative network, which they call the hypercycle. There are several kinds of replicator, A, B, C, and D. The rate of replication of each kind is an increasing function of the concentration of the replicator immediately preceding it in the cycle. Thus, the rate of replication of B increases with the concentration of A, and so on around the circle. And the circle is closed because the rate of replication of A increases with the concentration of D. That's the hypercycle. We'll come back to this a bit later. And this is a kind of the example of in ecology, you have these hypercycles. Well, the idea is that you have hypercycles at many different levels of complexity. You have hypercycles at the level of the just replicating molecules, and you have living cells that are themselves these complexes of different molecules and different organelles and different almost organisms on their own, but they all kind of work together symbiotically. And so even on the level of an ecosystem, you'll have the same thing happening, this kind of loop, this feedback loop, right? The three replicators here in this example are Daphnia, a water flea, Chlamydomonas, a single-cell green algae, and the stickleback fish. Daphnia feed on the algae and reproduce faster if there is plenty to eat. The same is true of sticklebacks and that feed on Daphnia. The rate of growth of the algae will depend, among other things, on the amount of nitrate in the water, and the sticklebacks excrete nitrate. Thus, each member of the cycle encourages the reproduction of the next one. And then stochastic correction and the evolution of protocells is a kind of model for why cells evolved from these processes that were not necessarily bounded by this kind of membrane or cell. So this is a model that kind of increases the chances that because in evolution, the question is always, what is the survival advantage? Why did it succeed? So you can reason kind of, reverse engineer some of these steps. And so what they propose is that that the creation of this cell was beneficial because it reduced the amount of mutations. It corrected the stochastic error. During replication, there's a tendency for black templates to outgrow white ones, but because of the small number of templates, there are chance variations as well. It's also assumed that protocells with both kinds of template grow faster than the cells with only one kind. When the protocell divides, templates are distributed randomly to the daughter cells. Mathematical analysis shows that the population settles down to an equilibrium with a constant proportion of optimal photocells. With 3 templates of each kind in this model, there's a group selection favoring protocells with both kinds of templates and individual selection favoring black templates within each cell. Because of the small number of templates per cell and the resulting chance variation, group selection can win out. And this is interesting also, like if you've ever wondered about how the cell emerged. The structures here, the structure is formed by long chain fatty acids in water. They call it bilipid structure, where each molecule has a head that mixes happily with water and a tail that is that shuns water. So there's a let's say hydrophobic side and hydroscopic side or something. And so they form a bilayered membrane. And so perhaps this happened in steps, like where these molecules were just lining up on some surface of some rock or something. And eventually kind of, as there's more and more of them, there's folding that happens. And eventually these cells kind of pop out from the substrate. So another example they give us is RNA as gene and enzyme transitions to DNA and protein. I've talked about this at other points. This is a very interesting transition, the RNA to DNA transition, because right now on like all life on Earth for the last what is it, 2 billion years or 4 billion years has been DNA based, and but there was a problem, like a kind of logical problem with how this could have happened, because the kind of Watson and Crick model is that the what do they call it? They called it the central dogma of molecular biology, which is that DNA produces RNA, and the RNA produces the protein, which is what happens. That's how the tissue structures, like the DNA is like the code of like the blueprint of life, let's say, and then the RNA kind of interprets it and then produces the proteins that will then become your tissue structures and all the different organs and all this. And there's today a division of labor between DNA and RNA that store and transmit information. So the nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, that store and transmit information, and proteins that catalyze chemical reactions and form much of the structure of the body, for example, muscles, tendon, hair. It seems increasingly plausible, and at this point, like although there's no proof of it, it seems like that the only evolutionary explanation. The other explanation would be the DNA just fell to Earth from another planet or something and came on but then we'd still have the same question: how did those DNA on another planet evolve or something? But okay, so if it evolved, it's increasingly plausible that there was at first no such division of labor, and RNA molecules performed both functions. The transition from an RNA world to a world of DNA and protein required the evolution of the genetic code, whereby base sequence determines protein structure. So we know RNA is extremely. This was not known at the beginning because RNA seemed to be like this in-between molecule between DNA and the protein. But it's now known that RNA, like we know RNA is a shape-shifting molecule. It can take on all kinds of shapes. It can take on different functions. It becomes different operators, let's say. It reconstructs itself and folds itself into different machines that process different molecules that do different things. And so it's thought that before DNA, everything was basically RNA-ish, or even like before RNA, there might have been, like we said, some other kind of autocatalytic nucleotide process. But eventually it was an RNA sequence, and this molecule just keeps doing different things. And so we know, for example, that RNA can mimic an enzyme. It's called a ribozyme. And so it can when there's no enzymes. Actually, that was one of the reasons for one of the main reasons for speculating about the RNA world is that where were the enzymes? You know, how did DNA start? You know, this chicken egg problem. How did the life get going if there was no enzymes to begin with? Because you would need both at the same time, and how does it get going? So RNA kind of solves that problem because RNA can mimic an enzyme. Yeah. You have here a more detailed view of the RNA translation process. So the idea is that ribozymes, which I just mentioned, acquired amino acids as cofactors. That is, an amino acid was attached to a ribozyme and made it a more efficient catalyst. Today, protein enzymes have cofactors, not, of course, amino acids, which they already have, bound to the surface of the enzyme at the active site and participating in the reaction. By using cofactors, the range and specificity of catalytic activity can be increased. Ribozymes would have been in greater need of cofactors than protein enzymes because the range of reactions they can catalyze without them is probably much smaller. They are composed of only 4 chemically different monomers instead of 20. Amino acids would have been the obvious candidates because, as Stanley Miller's experiment showed, they would have been abundant on the primitive Earth. And then another huge transition was the transition from prokaryotic to eukaryotic life forms. Cells can be divided into 2 main kinds. Prokaryotes, which lack a nucleus and have a single circular chromosome. And these include bacteria and blue-green algae. Eukaryotes have a nucleus containing rod-shaped chromosomes, and usually other intracellular structures called organelles, including the mitochondria and the chloroplasts. The eukaryotes include all other cellular organisms, including us. So from the amoeba to higher, organisms, mammals, and whatnot. Even if we accept the symbiotic theory of the origin of organelles, this does not explain the origin of the eukaryotic cell itself. First, there is the nucleus. Where did it come from? Is it too descended from a former symbiont, as some have suggested, or did it, as we think is more likely, evolve without symbiosis? The eukaryotic cytoplasm has other structures not found in prokaryotes, and in particular, there's a system of membranes known as the endoplasmic reticulum, whose origin and significance require explanation. Perhaps the most significant difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells is we want to understand the origin, if we want to understand the origin of the latter, is that the former are enclosed in a rigid cell wall, or at least a very rigid cell membrane, whereas many eukaryotic cells have no cell wall and change their shape vigorously. The absence of a cell wall makes possible a process called cytosis, a membrane-bounded vesicle. So there's no wall, but there's still a membrane, right? The membrane-bounded vesicle within the cell confuse with and become part of the cell membrane, or in the reverse process, a vesicle can be formed from the outer cell membrane. Cytosis is involved in many cellular processes, but perhaps its original role was phagocytosis, the process by which a eukaryotic cell can feed on solid particles. So we have a graphic of how this works. So the cell membrane is flexible, and it's kind of like it kind of allows the cell to ingest molecules from the outside, kind of take them in, suck out everything it needs, and then eject what it doesn't need. And then in eukaryotic cells, you have this. No, so this is the origin of mitosis. Sorry, this is still now in prokaryotic cells, I think. Bacterial cell division. The cell before division with a circular chromosome attached to the origin and the terminus to the cell wall. So they figure that this is probably how it happened. The chromosomes are attached to the cell wall, and as the replication happens, and these strings of chromosomes are getting longer and longer, eventually you run out of room on the cell wall, and there's like a kink in the cell wall that happens, and then that becomes the locus of where the cell divides. And since you have, so it just happens kind of mechanically, the cell division happens because of the internal process of replication, which just physically ends up kind of tearing the membrane. As it gets too big, it kind of tears itself apart and separates into two. And then this is a similar thing that happens, but on the level of eukaryotes. This is an interesting, also related to this, but how the nuclear envelope in eukaryotic cells, which have a nucleus, the possible origin is this invagination, where the outer cell membrane folds inside with some kind of other foreign molecule, and the cell finds it beneficial to keep it there, or for whatever reason there's an advantage caused by grabbing this alien, this outer molecule and keeping it inside and using it for something. And then eventually that, by the same process, that the opening closes in on itself and it becomes a separate bubble within itself, the endoplasmic reticulum. And then another big change was asexual life transition to sexual reproduction. In prokaryotes and in some eukaryotes, new individuals arise only by the division of a single cell into two, which is mitosis. In most eukaryotes, however, this process of multiplication by cell division is occasionally interrupted by a process in which a new individual arises by the fusion of two sex cells or gametes, produced by different individuals. Although familiar, this transition is actually one of the most puzzling. Yeah, it's one of the kind of reverse engineering ideas of why sex life emerged with eukaryotes and became so important is that with asexual reproduction, as you see in this graphic, it doesn't allow for a lot of parallel diversity and variation. Sexual reproduction and recombination produces a lot more variation, a lot more quickly with every generation, whereas asexual reproduction is basically in order to produce variety, you need to just wait for mutations to happen, and mutations that actually succeed are very rare. But when they do, then they kind of spread very quickly throughout the whole population and take over. So you see in the first graphic, you have A and AB and ABC, and they just kind of it evolves by appending new structures rather than sexual selection, which creates parallel structures, which then compete and whatnot. Compete in an evolutionary sense. They all strive to satisfy natural selective constraints, right? This transition has been called into question by a lot of researchers who've worked on this since these studies first came out. And actually the Szathmáry's most recent kind of account of this whole major transitions in evolution idea, they kind of drop sexual selection because it doesn't actually correspond to their concept of what major transitions need to have, which is they need to produce stable, overarching kind of complex structures that then regulate the variation beneath it. Whereas in sexual selection, it doesn't seem that that's the case. In fact, in life, it seems like sex is still an option even for more complex, not for mammals, but for lizards for sure, and for amphibians and all that. They can revert to parthenogenesis. They can revert at any point. Well, for whatever reason, it's possible for them to reproduce without sexual selection, reproduction. But so these are the main theories of how sex evolved. Sexual selection favors sexual populations because sexual populations can evolve more rapidly, and asexual populations accumulate deleterious mutations. 2, selection favors individuals that reproduce sexually because it pays an individual to produce a variable progeny. Sex makes repair of damaged DNA easier. Even within a population, selection may favor sexual individuals for reasons under 1 above. In the changing environment, their offspring may be better adapted to new circumstances, or in an unchanging environment, their offspring may have fewer harmful mutations. And 3, selection favors genes that cause individuals to undergo sexual fusion or to produce gametes that fuse, because then a gene present in one of the fusing cells can transfer to the other. So this is graphic demonstrating that. I'm skipping on some things because there's a lot here and we need to get to the logic part. So then protists to animals, plant and fungi. Animals are composed of many different kinds of cells, multicellular organisms, right? So this was also a huge transition, the transition from just, you know, communities of cells to these kind of complex structures that that house the cells, that reproduce them, that and where all of these different levels of interaction happen. So it's like a multicellular organism. So the same is true of plants, of fungi, and mammals and animals and whatnot. Each individual, therefore, carries not one copy of the genetic information, two in a diploid, but many millions of copies. The problem, of course, is that although all the cells contain the same information, they are very different in shape, composition, and function. In contrast, protists exist either as single cells or as colonies of cells of only one or a very few kinds. How do cells with the same information become different? How do different kinds of cells come to be arranged so that so as to form the adult structure? This is a big like question also, because all of the cells have the same DNA, but there's a kind of epigenetic aspect where different aspects of the same code are unlocked for production in a specific context. It's as if the cell knows which part of the DNA to read. And so that's all kind of built in from the top down somehow. So how are we feeling about this? Maybe I could get some interaction from you all. I'm just taking a look at my slides here. I'm going to jump. So any hands, or I don't know where to look for the hands.
I guess,
actually.
yeah. I think I'd be interested to know, like, beyond the kind of biological interest in this, like, if you see any application to this in a kind of broader philosophical sense, or kind of if you've applied this to anything else, or I guess kind of where is your interest born from this?
Okay, well, we're getting there. Let's continue. If we're almost there. So now solitary individuals to colonies. Let's just go quickly. And then animal societies emerge with a certain degree of sociality between the animals, competition between males and whatnot. And but this is an interesting example from biology. Nanomia, it's a coelentrate, a relative of sea anemones, anemones and jellyfish. And it looks like a single organism. It looks like a single kind of living thing with a bladder to keep it afloat, pumps to propel it through water, tentacles for killing prey, digestive organs, and organs for reproducing gametes. But all of these different structures turn out to be individuals that are modified and that kind of come together symbiotically to produce this superorganism that isn't really an organism. Yeah, so I think now we're getting into some things that would be a little bit easier to link to the logic stuff I had you read, the linear logic. These are three ways that we know genetic information can increase. And so the idea is like, how did things get more complex? Someone said, I think recent studies have shown that epigenetic factor can emerge from the bottom up. Yes, absolutely. They must emerge from the bottom up. I'm not saying there's any kind of top down. It's just that sometimes in evolution and biology, it's hard to get away from that kind of language of saying that there's a reason for which, like, you know, an organ evolved to do this, or this kind of teleologic aspect. is difficult to avoid. Anyway, so here we have duplication and divergence. A single gene duplicates and then two copies diverge in sequence. Symbiosis, two individuals with different ancestry and genetic information fuse, usually by one being allowed by the other, swallowed by the other, sorry. Epigenesis in multicellular organisms, the complete genetic message, which we just talked about, ABC, et cetera, is transmitted to the germline from fertilized egg to the gametes, which fuse to form the next generation. During development, the complete message is transmitted to all somatic cells, but different parts of the message are, in fact, are active at different in different cells. So yeah, so this was just the image, the same kind of thing, but I just kind of wanted to repeat that. And this is kind of where we come from. The primates, there were higher primates that have, you know, opposed thumbs and whatnot, and then somehow the major transition is language when it comes to humans. And in humans, so one of the things being studied is this kind of how when people don't know each other's languages, they kind of figure out how to communicate with each other, and that's called pidgin, like a kind of created language that emerges between, like, for example, slave populations, where it's just a bunch of people who don't speak the same language, and they just kind of invent a language to communicate. And then when children are born into these kinds of communities, the language that they speak is a Creole, because they actually learned it. So it's a natural language in a sense, but it was just invented as a kind of. And so what they find, or what is kind of interesting about these examples, is that it seems that there's a kind of universal grammar that is intrinsic to all humans, which is the kind of the great breakthrough by Noam Chomsky, and this idea that this idea of a language organ, that we all evolved to be able to speak using the same grammar. All languages can be translated into each other. We can all kind of say the same thing, and natural language allows us to communicate in the same ways. So the chemical analogy for this universal grammar is that a small number of kinds of atoms, hydrogen, oxygen, iron, and so on, can combine to form an immense number of different compounds, yet by no means all arrangements of atoms form stable compounds. In the same way, a small number of kinds of words, nouns, verbs, adverbs, and so on, can combine to form an immense number of sentences, yet not all combinations are grammatical. So there may be an analogy, and as any reader of this book will have discovered by now, we are great believers in the power of analogies to generate useful ideas. Chemistry is a powerful and sophisticated branch of science, largely opaque, as it happens to one of the authors of the book. Yet the rules governing how atoms combine can be simply explained. The first is the concept of valence. Each kind of atom has to be visualized as having a number of attachment points from one to the other, by which it can be linked to other atoms. Oxygen has valence of 2. Hence, one can form a molecule of water by linking oxygen, one oxygen and 2 hydrogens, but not 2 oxygens and 1 hydrogen. Of course, there's more to it than that, but it remains true that the simple rules of combination are obeyed. And so that's basically the idea that we don't usually think of language in this way. And I remember also coming from a continental philosophy kind of background, Chomsky's ideas were really frowned upon in my circle, you know, and I think that's, you know, that's too bad, but there's definitely something to it. And if you do accept that there is something to it, then what it means is that language somehow belongs in a certain category with all of the other transitions that we just looked at in biology, in evolution. This is just evolution coming up. Again, I'm using this teleological language, but language figuring out strategies for continuing to exist in the world, finding survival advantages by exploiting these, for example, these valences between atoms or whatever else. What can be connected together? What can't be connected together? What constitutes I think already you have a kind of to answer Gaston's question. The first thing I would say is that there's a primitive idea of, let's say, soundness, or to say, we could say truth and falsehood, but maybe that's a little bit too pointed or too specific, but some kind of idea where because of the evolutionary process and within the context of evolution, there is this error threshold, which means that you can't continue if you like your life will fizzle away into mutations, and just too many deleterious mutations, and just life doesn't continue. It has to find that balance, and in order to find that balance, it needs to, you know, have 1/n perfect copies of its template that gets copied perfectly. And so this kind of gives us a kind of primitive notion of right and wrong, or true and false, or something like that, where there is a perfect copy, and then there's an error. There's the copy that isn't right, the mutation, the error in the transcription. So yeah, so now we should maybe have some more questions. I'm not sure if this, should I read what's in the Adam said, on the point of why some cells do this and others do that with the same DNA, there's really interesting research by Michael Levin on the role of bioelectrical signaling. His lab managers. Okay, you can look at that. Do people want to turn on their microphones?
Adam, would you like to speak?
Yeah.
Adam, would you like to speak? You had raised your hand before.
Yeah, it was just for this comment, really. I think, you know, I'm summarizing. I'm not a biologist, but from what I understand from Michael Levin's research, yeah, you have these kind of bioelectrical signal networks that those control the embryonic development process, and that's how cells that are completely identical to one another, some of them will develop an arm and then others will develop an eye. And by manipulating the just the pattern of communications, just by blocking and synthesizing these impulses, they are actually able to take the cells that would naturally develop into an arm and make it develop into an eye with just high level control, and then everything else is the distributed intelligence. That's why he talks about it as movement through morphological space, or intelligence moving through a morphological space. Anyway, it just seemed to kind of relate, although it's like
Sure.
outside the classical paradigm, but maybe it's another direction.
Yeah, I just brought up this slide that I skipped over about Drosophila. This has been known for, this is much older science, but the idea that there's a string of this kind of these regions in the fly DNA that are directly related to the segments of the fly's body. So you can switch part of it off, and then the fly will not have the midsection or something like that, and you can do things like that. But that's different from what you were saying, Adam. It's so yeah. What else? Please.
Devin, would you like to speak? There are a couple of comments in the chat from Devin.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they were just comments more so than questions, although it's interesting to see the sort of analogical deployment of the evolutionary dynamics to something like language. And like as like Adam was saying, maybe topology can be like a sort of unifying perspective when it comes to like how they may interrelate more formally. So I think that's definitely an interesting approach for sure.
Yeah, topology is interesting. We'll definitely we will come to that soon. There's some like Girard, Jean Yves Girard had, part of his thing was at the early work was really in reaction to Scott domains, and which are kind of an early topological. Let's just advance a little bit, huh? Do you one thing is I'm not sure how fast I should be going through this, but you get the idea now. So blind spot. Yeah, so to continue what I was just saying, let's just give a quick idea of where Jean Yves Girard is coming from. When he was like 20 years old, he came up with this L2, which is a lambda cube. It's kind of a way of looking of describing the universe of lambda calculus languages, and he came up with the system F in the early 70s, I think. He was quite young, and was immediately given a job, and he's been sitting at this post for since that time, and just continuing to get deeper and deeper into his work. He's slowed down now. He's 70 years old or something. So this one right here is system F. It is lambda calculus with universal quantification. So they call it, well, now he calls it linear logic, kind of second order linear logic. So let's dive into this slowly. Please interrupt me at any time, okay? Causality and linearity. Although causality is a very complex thing, one can make a few remarks. Generally, the cause is part of the effect. This is why, since time immemorial, material implication was criticized. Technically speaking, this amounts to a refusal of weakening. So what he means is the critique of material implication is a refusal of weakening, not material implication is a refusal of weakening. It's the critique of material implication and this kind of abductive reasoning, when material implication is when you hear a sound, and then you look around you and you see something that might have made that sound, and you assume that that's what was the cause of the sound. So this material, you just say, oh, well, there's kind of a causal material implication that is kind of responsible for the effect. So you're kind of reasoning in reverse. You're saying you're inverting the lines of causality and saying, you know, I heard a sound, therefore this happened before, you know. Technically speaking, this amounts to a refusal of weakening. Weakening in logic and sequent calculus and, well, in natural deduction is when you have, you can say, if you have left weakening and right weakening, you say if A implies B, then A and C also implies B. So you're weakening the argument by you're making the argument weaker, but it's still true. It still holds, and the opposite of that is contraction, where you're kind of taking. You can cancel out things that appear in two places. You know, contracting the. I could give you better examples later, but and so weakening is the critique of weakening is the same as the critique of material implication. As an example, let us take relevant logics, which were fabricated in the years 1960 around a refusal of weakening and material implication, while trying to stay as close as possible to classical logic, which suggests a joke. Paradise is not that different from Earth. There are streets, brothels, banks, petrol wells. Saddam has just been removed. Without minimizing the nefariousness of that guy, so this is typical of Girard. He just goes off on tangents and makes somewhat lousy jokes, but they're all supposed to have a philosophical point. But finally, relevant logicians accumulated logical dictats, kind of like a list of statements or rules, and their systems never quite recovered from the absence of a Hauptsatz. A Hauptsatz, the Hauptsatz is Gensen's Hauptsatz, which is the cut elimination theorem. But let's just continue. I want to try to absorb some of this. So he's saying logic doesn't work that way. The cause does not survive the consequence. Take the hemlock. Socrates took it and there was no more of it. The same is typical in causality. The purchase, the money, which is the cause, let's say, of the money which is the cause of the purchase changes owner and cannot be reused by the same person. This is why contraction is usually wrong in the causal universe. You can't just, contraction basically means you can just get more money. You can just kind of pull it down. You can get it from the sky. Just because you can just contract, there's always more coming down, which is great. But this gives us an idea of what his whole project has been, because he says, because what he thought is that the worlds of Hilbert and the kind of the logic and the intuitionism also of the early last century was essentialist, he calls it. It's as if, so he keeps critiquing this idea that we've understood logic until now, formal logic from Frege onwards. We've kind of assumed that we can use our operators at will, our logical operators at will. We can always have more of them. And he wants to take logic into an existential mode where you don't have, you only have a limited amount of resources that you can use. So it's a resource, linear logic is a resource sensitive. kind of logic. And here he already makes the link with quantum mechanics and says, you know, quantum mechanics is a perfect example for this, because when I measure the spin of an electron, it changes state. It orients along the z-axis just to please me. It is, by the way, the quantum world which seems the most purely causal in the sense of linear logic. But there are causalities, and he notes there are causalities where the cause very well survives to its effect. For example, in a radio broadcast or reception, one cannot say that the fact of opening one's receiver changes whatsoever to the broadcast. You know, you can't stop the broadcast by turning off your receiver. You're only turning off the reception. So those are actions without reaction. And so linear logic also allows for that. You know, it gives you the opportunity to do that. If that's the case, if that's what you need to model, then you can still do that. But it doesn't come for free. It's not you're not taking that for granted. You're very careful about these resources and about managing these resources. This is from the same text again, action versus reaction. We are in the process of interpreting causality by linear implication, and that's the linear implication symbol, quid of negation. It can be seen as an observation, as a question that one asks. What in the quantum world is close to a destruction? The adjunction, which enables one to pass from A implies B to not B implies not A. Is that a question posed to B is transmitted to A? If one thinks that observation means destruction, one sees that it is a matter of reaction, which, by destroying the premise, impedes its reuse. And in fact, that's what happens when a quantum system, if you observe it, you change it. So you can only observe it once. Once you take a look, you've used up that opportunity. There's a destruction. And then he says, let us consider typical action-reaction pairs. The style, write, read, send, receive, much different from the Tarskian pair, speak, true, lie. There is no strict equality between the partners. One is active, the other is passive. From the logical viewpoint, formulas will be split into active, positive, and passive, negative ones. Cut elimination, the hand can change polarity, therefore only deals with the initial situation. Think of an epistolary exchange. And so we're starting to see now, okay, so what are we talking about here? He just linked linear implication with negation. There's something about implication that is very close to negation. How does that work? Well, he kind of gave us a kind of suggestive idea here, is that we have a large playing field, and each action, each implication, let's say, each operation happens through negation somehow. And it's kind of, in fact, yeah. Let me just, maybe I can, let me just see if I can jump a little bit ahead here. I thought I had the diagram somewhere. Yeah, I don't have it here. Okay, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's just continue. So, two conjunctions. Phases suggest an approximate analogy with money, time, space, food. Indeed, everything that can be styled as a resource. The main quality of a resource is that it cannot be duplicated. In other words, that the rule of contraction does not apply. To such an extent that one speaks of the miracle of loaves and fishes, and that the law severely represses the duplication of money. The notion of resource is less clearly antagonistic to weakening. Everything depends on whether we read weakening as a destruction or as non-use. And physics, so in physics, opposes the blunt destruction of matter, and the destruction of money is a criminal offense, although possible. But then he says, but one can decide not to use all the resources, and that's a different thing. So, and actually, this is one of the questions I have for him. Is it really possible not to use all the resources? I mean, the question, because in biology, if you take it from a biological standpoint, adaptation, say from one of the important models in this world is the free energy principle, where it's a kind of thermodynamic / Bayesian principle for adaptation, learning, gradient descent, whatnot. It's all these things together. So learning about your environment is the same as adapting to the environment and whatnot. And there's a thermodynamic aspect to it, which is basically you're as long as there's still free energy in your system, you can still continue adapting, and you're kind of forced to spend it in a way. So you can't just like an organism can't just decide not to spend the resources. So that would be an interesting question to see whether we have to drop that clause if we want to model biology. That's one of the questions for me. So interpretation in the style of money. Turnstile B, if you just start with, this is an assertion that B. So the assertion of B means that I got B for free of charge, for the price of the neutral element, $0. A implies B, well, this is the turnstile implication, means that one can get B by paying A. The tensor product A times B, did they say times B? I think so, it's times, yeah. A times B is a conjunction of both to pay A and to pay B, or to get A and to get B. Which explains this slightly worn out example. If A stands for $1, B and C stand for 2 brands of cigarettes, then A implies B, or A implies C, means that for $1, one can get a pack of Nationali, or in another example, it says Marlboros, but Nationali, or you can get MS. So linear logic inference yields A times B implies B times C, but not A implies B times C. In other terms, to get the 2 packs, one must pay A times A, i.e. $2. One could play in the same way with the chemical equations, and remember that the non-respective proportions in chemical equations, once more, the contraction rule, often causes deadly accidents and explosions. One can, in the same conditions, conclude A implies B with C. So it's a different operator, it's a different conjunction. Linear logic offers you 2 kinds of conjunction. One, which is the tensor product, the first one we just looked at. When I say times, it's the tensor product. And if I say with its this other product, which is it's another conjunction, which is called an additive conjunction, whereas the tensor product is a multiplicative conjunction. This is an additive conjunction. So it has a kind of, it's a conjunction with a slight disjunctive aspect to it. The Cartesian product A with B, it's a Cartesian product, does not mean, so the first one is the tensor product, the Cartesian product is the second one. A with B does not mean both. It does not mean both together, as you get with the tensor product. You have one or the other. It's the one that that pleases you, whichever one you get to choose which one it is. So if you have A with B, you can have either A or B, and you get to choose. Think of a vending machine. One inserts a coin and one will get, as one pleases, either nationality or MS, but not both. One sees that the conjunction with has a disjunctive aspect, one or the other. The connective plus, and now we're into a purely disjunctive operator. Now we have a plus, which is like addition, or like, it's like real orness, pure orness. The connective plus provides us with another idea, purely disjunctive. A plus B means one or the other, but you don't get to choose. This is the case of the result of a lottery, for instance. Shall we pause? How are you? How's that being absorbed? Yeah. So he's like, he's being a little bit more. So what it is that he's being like, we have in the logical connectives of and or are being, it's like we're breaking them apart and looking at what's behind them. The assumptions, sometimes we use and, or sometimes we use and in one way, and sometimes we use it another way. And the two ways are not really the same. And that's, so he says, why don't we just have two operators, right? Just two different operators. One is a tensor product where you get both things together, almost like a fusion of the things together into one. And with you get both things, but you can only use one at a time. You can use this one or that one, not really both at the same time. You can only use one at a time. So it's like saying, it's hard to give an example of that. Maybe he has one. So, and then with the purely disjunctive, the plus, you have one or the other, but you can't choose. It's like a lottery. So is this serious? Yes, it enables us to represent in a faithful way, by means of logical consequence, a lot of concrete computation processes. Thus, Petri nets, we wire cells of the form A, B, and they fuse together into C. If tokens are put in compartments, A and B, this fires a transition. The two tokens disappear, and one new token appears in C. Linear logic represents this as an axiom. A times B implies C, or AB implies C. This representation is faithful, contrary to intuitionistic consequence, which would rightly conclude the presence of a token in C, but would not free compartments A and B. Let us say at once that in spite of a certain infatuation with this, okay, that's not important. Complexity of the fragments is not super important either. Let's just skip that. And then he comes to the fourth operator, the par, which is an upside down and sign, which is the kind of, so it's the upside down with operator symbol. If one understands negation as an exchange between production and demand, one can try to transpose the Petri cell into, you just flip the arrow directions and make all of the objects negative. So if we start with a coffee machine, which from A 50 cents and B 20 cents produces a coffee C, this means that a demand for coffee translates into a demand for 50 cents and 20 cents. So you can look at par as a kind of demand. It flips around, it flips the arrows around. It's almost like as if like logic, the implication is flowing in the opposite direction. This means that a demand for, yeah, okay. A times B implies C transposes as not C implies not A, par, not B. Hence, some people were tempted to write an equation in the style of times equals par, which is at least logically an atrocity. There's all kinds, this comes back in various texts. There's a lot of people who've worked on this in different ways, but so he says that it isn't the same thing. If one looks closely, one finds a confusion between, on the one hand, a demand for A and for B, and a demand for A and a demand for B. This is not the same. And I don't. So those of you who read the other text on the mathematics of language, there's a point. He makes this point later in the text, the Bob Coecke's text there. When one asks for 2 coins, one really needs both of them, and just one of them won't do. A more correct version would be, for instance, if I got A, then I demand B, and by no way a Petri net with the 2 inputs. One sees that with par, one reaches the limits of the usual language. This is rather banal. Thus, I had problems when writing down, he said this several times in all of his works. When he gets to par, he has trouble giving an example of it because it's just very strange. It's so where the other ones you have this clear idea. Times is an operator that puts 2 things together, puts things together into one. With puts 2 things together such that they're kind of in your bag and you can reach for one of them, but then only one at a time. You can only use one at a time. And you can choose which one. And with plus, you don't get to choose. They're together in the bag, but it's nature decides, or time will tell, you know, or you get some kind of effect, but you can't decide. And then with par, you get something where there's a kind of reversal that happens, like he says, the arrows are reversing. And so he gives this idea of communicating vessels where there's like a kind of pump or something, where if you go in one direction, it comes out the other direction. So you can kind of think of it this way. I think this is how I imagine par, is that you have, it puts 2 things together. They call it what do they call it? Multiplicative disjunction is what it is, right? You're putting 2 things together, but they're disjunctive somehow. And so what happens is that when you use one, it's like you have a lack of the other one. You have a demand for the other one. You're left with a lack of the other one. You put 2 things together, and when you use one of them, you're left with a like a negative lack of the other thing that you put there. And likewise, if you use the other one, then you're left with a lack of the other one. Got that? So that, I mean, it's very abstract, but And he gives this other example with an extension chord. There's a conjunction between A and B, and in this sense, that an action A is concomitant to the action B, but they don't exist independently. Thus, the extension chord establishes a concomitance between A, that is the right to A on the right to give 20 volts, and not A on the left to receive or to consume 220 volts. Without the presence at rest of the slightest electric current. So it doesn't do anything when you have them together, but when you use them, there is this opposite aspect to both ends. Okay, let's pause there. How are you guys doing? I saw there was some activity. I haven't completely followed up on it. Okay, we're gonna stay here.
Would anyone like to ask any questions?
I'm not gonna read it. It'd be really easier if you just spoke.
Yeah, I'm not sure if these are comments or from Devin.
Devin,
You're
would you like
invited.
to?
Yeah, if you're invited, if you'd like.
Is
Yeah, sorry, give me 1 second.
non-contraction.
Yeah, it's going back a little bit. It's not.
Okay. Yeah, that's
directly
okay.
what
We
you
can
were
go
just
back
talking
now. We
about.
can. It's. I mean, I don't care like where this goes. We can just go wherever you guys want to go. I just wanted to get to these basic things. If we don't get to Bob Coecke, it's not that important. But so let me just continue here. Here we have the quantifiers, modalities. So the world is imperfect, imperfection. We come back to the traditional world, the imperfect world. Imperfection corresponds to actions that last, that repeat themselves. For us, it will be, so he means that in a language like the perfect tense and the imperfect tense. Imperfection corresponds to actions that last, that repeat themselves. For us, it will be synonymous of eternal, intangible, once and for all. In other words, of truth and eventually of infinity and of essence. So he doesn't want to completely get rid of the kind of traditional way of thinking about logic. But what you do, the way linear logic is set up is that you can't, it doesn't come out of the box. You have to build that yourself. If you want to be able to use your operator as many times as you like, then you can still do that. You just need to add this of course operator to it, which is it's not really an operator. It's like I think it's a constant. It doesn't get used up. It's always there. You can always, so of course just means you can get A as many times as you want. Of course A. We can see of course A. Of course is just the exclamation mark symbol as a logical symbol. We can see of course A as a passage to the limit. A times many, many A's times A, infinitely many times, or better, ad libitum. We can think of an absence of reaction, or at least of negligible one. Thus, the level of the waters does not lower when I drink a glass. So he thought like the ocean is like this. Well, that's kind of the idea that you have. You can take as many spoonfuls from the ocean, and you'll never spend it all. That's also important for us, I think, if you want to model biology. In this perspective, the fundamental principle would be, of course A implies that A times of course A, i.e. if A ad libitum, then A and A is still available ad libitum, which is only an approximation. Indeed, the principles are organized into dereliction, weakening, contraction, and promotion. So you can get contraction and weakening back by using this this exponential, as it is called, which gives a kind of modality to it and also allows you to do things like quantification. So the exponential is a sort of copying machine which can yield one copy, dereliction, or be erased, weakening, or duplicate itself, contraction. Thinking of computation, of course, A corresponds to a static part that will not change, typically something in ROM memory in a computer. He gives examples like this that are very outdated sometimes, like DVD players and menus and things like that. But anyway, the reason why also this text is kind of his magnum opus at the end of his career, where he puts everything together into one big book. Some work happened after the book, but this is the bulk of it. You can see the kind of reverse influence, because when he came up with linear logic in the mid 80s, 86, 87, immediately people realized, okay, well, at first it was clear that it had something to do with computation, because he worked very much in the context of lambda calculus and type theory and normalization. And so that was obvious, but then the quantum aspect was a bit more of a surprise, and immediately people saw, other researchers saw the relevance of this logic to quantum physics. And it became known as, well, there's another logic due to quantum logic due to von Neumann and Birkhoff, that it's like lattice theory, and it's complicated and it's perfectly sound for a certain way of thinking about quantum physics. However, when you get into quantum computing, or like what can you do with a quantum system, this kind of linear logic introduces a kind of dynamic aspect, like where you can make things, which became, which was immediately seen to be very relevant for quantum physics. And then he's kind of retroactively started thinking about linear logic in a quantum way. At least that's how it seems to be. And I don't know to what point he kind of already knew that it was relevant for quantum mechanics, but in any case, it made history that way. And now we're noticing that the Bob Coecke article I gave you to read as well, where he talks about, he was giving a talk in Montreal at McGill, and Lambek was in the audience, and Coecke was talking about his linear logic application for and string diagram application to quantum physics. And Lambek was in the audience and said, "Hey, that's actually what I'm working on. That's very similar to my language models." And they realized that actually, yeah. So that's a very interesting topic for me, anyway. Is that this logical discovery had so many applications? I guess that's it. If it is. This is why linear logic is not just some other, paraconsistent fuzzy logic experiment with logic, which happened a lot, like you mentioned some of these, but he's very critical of a lot of these kinds of other logics which are not motivated. He finds them unmotivated. A lot of the other substructural logics where you just take first order logic and you kind of just drop some of the you kind of restrict it in certain ways and see what happens, to see whether you can get away with it and see what happens. Most of those don't do much, but linear logic was different in the sense that it had this motivation. It created, it allowed us to talk about all kinds of things that are very natural to us in natural language. And I'm still not ready to say why it is that the logic is so powerful, but yeah, we'll leave it at that. We can speculate. Any comments before we go on?
Could you say something about the lollipop?
The lollipop. Oh, is that
The implication symbol, just because
Oh,
I'm
the
trying
lollipop.
I'm
Yeah,
trying to
this-
understand. I mean, like with the conjunction, multiplicative conjunction, the tensor, you have if you
It's a
have
lot.
like
Yeah.
fire times water, lollipop,
Here we are.
water.
This is
How is that then different from just like fire with water? I mean, it seems like I like the implication seems to be really important for how you are going to read the
right.
difference between the conjunctions and the disjunctions.
Yeah, okay, so one thing to say about that is that the first thing about why it was so interesting in computer science, I have a note about it here, where we move away from the kind of implication in, I don't have, like, I can't draw it, but you know, the arrow that you usually see from A to B, that's implication written that way, in logic, in propositional logic, and you have so I guess the motivation for changing the connective is that because in propositional logic, A implies B means if A is false, no, it means A is false or B is true. Whereas, so you have not A or B. That's what the classical implication means. But in linear logic, you have something more like, which is what he was saying, if you have an A, you can get B. B is accessible to you. It's not necessarily that it follows. It's just that it is somehow accessible. And so it's much more friendly to a computer science perspective on things, which is what we're talking, well, what he was working on, you know, computability. We should say something about this whole school that he came from, because there's a split in the last century. A lot of you know, because of the crisis in foundations and the paradoxes discovered, you know, in logic and mathematics in the early 20th century, there was all this fuss also in philosophy about, you know, about discovering kind of foundations for empirical, like to kind of reducibility conditions to kind of really understand language, and to figure out, like, logical positivism was basically this. We're trying to figure out how to kind of reduce all of our meaning to very specific things, specific actions in the world. So that's semantics, right? That's all kind of figuring out. We had this logic that all seemed to work pretty well, and then we had, and then there were some problems with it. So we had to look at what it is we're talking about. Like, we're talking about real things. So, you know, set theory comes out of this idea too. It's like, what is the semantics? What are we talking about here? Well, we have things, and we have collections of things whatever they are, they're just things. They're just collect bags of things. The things are also containers, ad infinitum. So that's semantics. Also, and then the real breakthrough was, there was a lot of work on the semantic side of things in the last century, and the real big advances, we could say, are category theory and model theory, which are semantic. They're kind of new semantics for mathematics and logic that allowed us to see different, they're very very flexible semantics. And by semantics, we just mean the meaning of what we're talking about, what it is that we're dealing with, what it is that we're talking about in language, what it is that we're referring to, what is it in the real world that we're referring to. And syntax in logic, which is something to keep in mind when we're also reading this stuff on linguistics, where syntax is a very specific kind of limited thing. Syntax in linguistics just means the order of the words in a phrase, right? Whereas the grammar is like all of these rules for application of, and so in logic, that would be the syntax. All of that is syntax. All the grammar is absorbed into syntax. Really, syntax is just whatever is not semantics, whatever is not the meaning of what we're talking about. It's just all of the extra structure, the operations, the rules that allow us to express or convey, communicate these things that we're talking about. So on the syntactic side, I just mentioned model theory, category theory. There was a lot of progress in the last century in that side, the semantic side. The syntactical side was represented by there's only like one big breakthrough, which is Gensen and his Hauptsatz, and is where he's looking at natural deduction and sequent calculus and trying to look at rewrite rules, only rewrite rules. So looking at what it is that we do, like when we manipulate our logical propositions in order to get to create to prove that it is true, we can to prove that a proposition is true. There's a certain amount of permutation that you can do on the proof, and so he was studying this, and this is where this whole kind of weakening contraction language comes from, and especially the cut rule and the cut elimination theorem comes out of Gensen, and kind of basically that was the syntactic breakthrough of the last century. And Girard places himself, or like he is the kind of successor to Gensen in a way, because it's really a breakthrough in syntax rather than semantics. And so he in his later project, he even calls it transcendental syntax. He's trying to explore what are the assumptions behind the way that we, the kind of ways that we that we structure our thoughts, that we preserve structure through transformations of ideas, and all of that is very difficult to see. In fact, he calls it transparency. It's transparent. So it's very hard to make any progress in this field, but so that's why it's all kind of really tiny baby steps in this field. So that's syntax. Yeah, so I have this. Does anyone have anything to say about that?
Yes, sorry, really quick. How do you spell Jensen?
Gentzen, Gentzen, I think. Yeah, so this is I have this graphic up here, which is, I find very helpful for kind of mapping things out. Anyone who's curious about these operators and how they all kind of fit in this landscape, linear logic. This graphic is really helpful. So you have the operators going around here on the top left kind of corner of the square shape. You have the tensor product, which is times. We call it, when you say it out loud, you call it times or tensor. And so this is so if you look at this vertical ellipse, you have what is called the multiplicative fragment of linear logic. And this fragment is studied on its own. This one fragment is used to model all kinds of things already. In fact, so then you can use just the multiplicative fragment plus the universal quantifier, or the exponentials, which also I think what Bob Coecke is doing is exactly that. He's just using the multiplicative and the multiplicative this left vertical ellipse here. So, and the exclamation mark, the of course operator. So you have the way it's set up here. You have on the top, you have the tensor product, and on the bottom you have par, and the two are duals of each other. They're opposites. And right next to, so let's just keep going. Let's just go around this. So you have first the tensor product, then the Cartesian product, which is with, and now we're in on the right right vertical ellipse, which is the additive aspect or additive fragment of linear logic. By additive, normally we mean, so in traditional logic, you have classical logic, you have and or. And is a kind of multiplication, and an or is a kind of addition, generally, depending on the category we're dealing with, but in generally. So now, but that addition is down here on the lower part of this right vertical ellipse, which is that's the plus symbol, which is the kind of conventional or idea, the kind of orness, disjunction. It's a pure disjunction. But you should see with as a kind of in between. It's almost a disjunction, but not totally. It has a so they call with a additive conjunction, and they call plus a additive disjunction. So it's additive and disjunctive. So just to recall then, what par is the multiplicative disjunction. So as you go around here, you're getting relations of the multiplicative side. You have the conjunctive side and disjunctive side, multiplicative, additive. So you can say, you can just look at, you can just point to these here. and say, oh, this is an additive conjunction. This is a multiplicative multiplicative conjunction. Yeah, multiplicative conjunction like this. And this is an additive disjunction. And this is a multiplicative disjunction. And in the center there is what we were talking about a bit earlier. This question of what Maure was asking about the lollipop. This new linear operator, which is implication, it's called linear implication, is in the center there. And what else is in the center there? What do we have there? We have a blank with a falsum in superscript, which means which is a negation. It's a kind of it's linear negation. I should mention also that the with all four operators is a constant. So with the tensor product, you have the 1, which is the identity of the tensor product. So as in multiplication, you multiply something by 1 and you still have the same thing, right? So it doesn't change. It's a kind of constant for the tensor product. Likewise, for addition, for the plus, you have the 0 as a constant, because 0 plus something is just the same thing. It's the same thing left untouched, right? So it doesn't do anything. It's the neutral element, as they call it. And the other two connectives, the with and the par, have two other constants, which are truth, T, and falsum, or absurdity. And then there's a kind of, an absurdity is used to define negation. And negation is just, if any of you are familiar with linear algebra, it helps a lot, actually, because a lot of these ideas come from linear algebra, and the negation is basically the same as in linear algebra. What you're doing is you're just flipping your matrix, if anyone knows that, across the diagonal. You know, you're taking your matrix and you're just negating it, flipping it. It's the opposite matrix. So that's why you have this kind of link between implication and negation, because it's almost as if any action is a rotation around negation. And this is really interesting philosophically, because it actually goes back to the origin of philosophy, or one of the origins, but Parmenides and his idea of, change being impossible, because he said if change, nothing, time, things don't change, because if they did, it means that somehow they would have to stop existing. Like the thing would have to just not be. Being would no longer, in order for being to change, it would have to not be, and then something else be, And he said that's impossible. Therefore, nothing changes. But this idea integrates the same. It's the same intuition. It said in order to change something. Changing something, or this application of a kind of implication, is a kind of change. It's a process, and doing that always is done through negation somehow. You're negating the original thing, and so this is at the center of it all, and that's what allows linear logic to be resource sensitive, because because every time you use something, you change it, which is also what the relevance is for quantum physics. Quantum physics, you have just Hilbert space, and it's just basically rotating in different ways. And each subspace is also a Hilbert space, and you're kind of just applying Hilbert spaces to Hilbert spaces, and you still get a Hilbert space. So implication and negation are intricately related. How's that? How are you doing? I don't see any faces now.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go now. I think that it's possible for you to continue going. And if anyone wants to speak, they can. Or we're at 2 hours, so it
Yeah.
can also end.
Yeah.
Devin, if you'd like to speak, I'm going to head out now, so thank
Okay.
you very much.
I'm gonna be
Thank
here.
you, Maure.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Yeah, Devin, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering about this logic of the non-contraction, that there's maybe like theoretical possibilities with antimatter to produce maybe energy from nothing, or perhaps reversing some of the cost. And then nowadays, with like modern monetary theory, governments can sort of discreetly print money without consequence, since the money is sort of based on like the perception of the population.
Yeah. So maybe. And the thing is, I mean, you could still, if you wanted to model those kinds of things, then you would just append a of course symbol, where if there is a resource that is constantly replenished, then you would model it with this exponential here, the of course symbol, which just means that you can get more. You can just always have more. So the idea is that you retain all of the expressive capacities of classical logic, but you have to build them up from a lower level, because you're not taking them for granted. You have more subtle operators to work with, so you can still build that up. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, that these kinds of things don't exist. And that's why he said, in some cases you might need this kind of expressive resource in order to talk about what you're talking about. So yeah, that's a good question though. Yeah. So anything else? How are you guys feeling? Do you want to go into, what are you more interested in? Do you want to just stop, or do you want to go into more of the language stuff, or what are you thinking? I want to get the feeling here from the remaining people. And for this, you can just write it in the thing, but language, yeah? All right, so let's go. Let's go to language. So here he talks about negation and quantum coherent spaces. I think, okay, so yeah, before we go into language, I think coherent spaces are really interesting for okay, let me just, let's do this. There's all kinds of, there's interesting, we didn't talk about geometry of interaction, which is, I think, is something we need to talk about before we go. Where does he talk about that? Geometry of interaction is something he started working on right after figuring out linear logic, because he was like on a lower level substructural logic. And one way of thinking about linear logic is that it restricts logic. It's substructural in that sense. And he says sometimes that it's like classical logic, but with its hands tied behind its back. And so for him, that was like, okay, but it wasn't satisfactory. You're kind of making a logic that is defective somehow, and you have to build up what you meant in classical logic from more primitive structure. And so he started thinking about what is the semantics of this highly abstract logic. And one of them is, he came up with like a series of ideas for thinking of linear logic, which he had developed in the context of proof theory, and therefore in the context of these proof nets that are kind of networks or webs of implication. We call them, they're basically lattices or partially ordered sets, these kinds of constructions where there's a notion of inclusion, nested and order of priority, and some things are parallel and some things are above each other. And then you have this idea that you can define domains and regions in these spaces that are what he called, well, in the coherent space, the idea is that a different region of this logic is downward closed. And then you can kind of think of different aspects of a proof as when you normalize a proof. We didn't talk about cut elimination, but maybe it's a bit complicated. We don't want to get into anything like that, I guess. But the idea is that the cut elimination theorem, let's talk about it. Cut elimination. It comes from this idea of the cut. The cut rule is the idea that you can put together two proofs and make a bigger proof, which is, or the idea in the best example, the well-known example is modus ponens, which is if A implies B and you have A, therefore B. You can, and then the other one is there's another one called Barbara, and it's the syllogism, which is you have A implies B, and C and B implies C, therefore A implies C. So it's basically just cutting out this. And so because you have this cut rule, the cut rule allows you to connect different parts of these proofs together and to build bigger ones, and then to continue the work of deduction. And then what this Hauptsatz, that Gensen, we talked about Gensen earlier, Hauptsatz is the cut elimination theorem. He discovered that you could, that any proof that can be expressed with this cut rule can also be expressed without this cut rule. And so that was basically the basis for Girard's kind of interest in this whole thing. And so the idea is that eliminating cuts is kind of like normalizing a proof. And in fact, it's related to the Curry-Howard isomorphism, if you know something about that, like the functional programming and all this. The idea that a proof, programs are proofs, are types. And so a proof is a program. And you could make that, you can normalize the program. You can make it more efficient by getting rid of all these unnecessary aspects of it. So even if you constructed this thing with the cut rule, you can get rid of the cut rule. You can get rid of all the cuts and create this cut eliminated version of it, which corresponds to the kind of the normal form of the proof. You're normalizing the proof by doing this. And so there's this idea of a dynamics that develops in his work. So that's what the whole proof net and this whole thing about Scott domains, which I mentioned earlier. Scott domains were a kind of topological idea of type theory. And he said he wasn't comfortable with that topology because of all the infinities and all these unnecessary kind of these infinities that emerge and in the topological interpretation. So he restricted it to just very simple kind of just a finite system with just some, it's basically just a lattice of connections, like a web of implications. And the coherent space is just that. The coherent space needs to be downward closed. And there's this definition of stability. And so this develops for him into a kind of game theory inspired idea. It's not game theory, though. It's not at all the same resources. But it is a kind of game semantics. And this is important for our whole thing about evolution and language, because it's almost as if, well, it is this. It's the idea is that you could have a bunch of players or agents who are all applying or trying to prove something. They all have something to prove, and everyone else is trying to disprove the other one. And so you have this kind of normative aspect, this normative semantics for, it's almost as if the logic, the kind of proof net, or the logic that will be permitted in the normal form once everything gets normalized and everything gets processed down to the normal form. So logic, or the syntax, is emerging from a lower down process that is not itself purely syntactical. At least that's the intuition he wants to convey. Whether he does it completely is not. And so there's this other thing about so he calls this the geometry of interaction, and he worked on this for a long time after linear logic. And there's this very important equation, which is the feedback equation, which is now, if you take that whole grid of implications, that whole proof net, and you kind of you kind of wind it up into its the central feedback equation that's happening at every move. This dynamics of the normalization is happening from the point of view of, let's say, each entity or actant participating. There's this feedback process that's happening. And I also find that extremely interesting to compare to obviously the feedback, the processes in evolution. Okay, let's jump to language. Yeah, so here, I hadn't prepared a ton of stuff on the Bob Coecke, but just a few things to show this. Okay, bye, Adam. I just saw some people are leaving. Let me just get to this real quick. You have this this idea that the same resources that Bob Coecke uses to describe quantum computing, quantum teleportation, quantum. Oh, actually, that's an interesting aspect of it too. There's this aspect of quantum physics that seemed counterintuitive for people like in the late 70s, early 80s, which is that it's impossible to clone a quantum system, and it's impossible to delete the quantum system. That's what what Girard was talking about when he said you can't destroy a system. So there's this no cloning theorem and there's no deletion theorem, and that comes for free in linear logic. By default, you can't create anything out of nothing, and you can't just clone something, you can't weaken, and you can't contract, you can't so yeah, that comes for free. And then so after I mentioned that Lambek and Coecke met in Montreal sometime, and then he started working on this problem of language. And so in the paper here, he's expanding on some of these ideas using this calculus. And you can see here in this graphic here, I highlighted bytes, and that's because you have a kind of you have a negation, and that's what we said that negation and implication are related in linear logic, and this comes out here where you see that a verb is also the shape of a negation. It's a verb and a negation, or a verb and its negation are the same shape, really. They're just like a negated verb is just a different verb, right? It's just it's another kind of verb. And so nouns are considered states. And so you have to think of time going downwards in this, and it's confusing because in a lot of Coecke's work, he draws it the other way, it goes upwards. But in this work, because of whatever reason, he had to draw it this way, and I think it makes more sense this way for a bunch of reasons. But you go, so time, let's say, or it's not like physical time, but let's say computational time, operational time is going downwards. We read it from top to bottom. And so these states are at the top. They're just that's just the state of the world as it is now. And then you go downwards. So he says that you have these three sentences. Alice is a dog, Bob is a person, Alice bites Bob. And so you can draw it with this diagrammatic calculus. So what it is that so yeah, they changed it a little bit in the disco the circuit one that he's talking about, where Alice and Bob, since their agents are no longer just nouns, they're now active agents, and so they don't have a box at the top. They're just lines. They are lines. And if they die, their line stops, right? So so you can put these sentences together logically. You can analyze them. You can say Alice is a dog, and dog is just a state that combines with the tensor product. It's a multiplication. Alice is, times dog, and then still Alice. We still have her line, but she is dog. And then Bob on his side is person. And this bite operation, someone bites someone else, this operation, which is a verb, is also a state. And then when it gets consumed, it flips around. I think I have that in the next slide. He has a different example here about the shootout, these cowboys in a shootout. There are different relations between them. There's some that are static relations, and some of them are more dynamic relations. And so you can see that processing or consuming the state is turning it upside down. So it's kind of like negating it. It's like using it is negating it. And in fact, what's happening there is you're using the other aspect of the multiplicative fragment of linear logic, the par, which is basically that. It flips something around. You Where actually, and this is related to also to something that had been discovered in the string diagrams, like the Feynman diagrams in physics, which where it became, it became convenient to draw these Feynman diagrams, and then to represent particle and antiparticle pairs as like an antiparticle is just a positive particle traveling backwards in time. That's the kind of intuition. Of course, they say, oh, that's just abusive notation and all that, but that's logically kind of an effect, a result of an action is like something happening backwards. It's like time, time going back, or like an effect is the opposite of a state. It acts backwards in time somehow. And that's operated by the par symbol. And then, oh yeah, and then he talks about, we talked about this as well. So there's two kinds of conjunctions here, right? So you have Alice wears a hat and a scarf. And then the second sentence, you have Alice and Bob wear a hat. And the two senses of and are different in each case. You have, because, why is that? Because of this resource sensitivity. The same kind of thing as when you have a coin to buy cigarettes in the vending machine. Alice wearing both a hat and a scarf only requires one Alice, while Alice and Bob both wearing a hat requires two hats. In the case of the former, we assign two properties to a single agent, namely wearing a hat and wearing a scarf, while in the second case, a single property, wearing a hat, is attributed to two agents. So the sense of and is different in both cases. It's not the same and. We use it in normal language. We don't notice this difference because and just means two things together. But logically, if you look at the dependencies between the nouns and the verbs and the objects, you have a different meaning to the and. It's not the same and. It says a physical analogy would be that and in the first sentence refers to having two physical particles, for example, a proton and an electron, while and in the second sentence lists two properties of a single particle, position and velocity. So I said exactly, nonlinearity allows copying. So he says this nonlinear conjunction allows for copying. So that's the plus, no, that's the with symbol, and the linear one is the tensor product. So nonlinearity allows copying, cloning, weakening, contraction, and deletion, which is important. Quantum physics doesn't allow that, but so while linearity means that the operator can only be used once. And so he shows this in this diagram here, Alice and Bob wear a hat. It's very simple as a sentence, but actually what's going on behind the scenes is that wear is being copied twice. Within wear, you have two copies of itself, and then they're being used separately to say two different lines. And the idea is that you're preserving structure through these transformations. That's the kind of goal of all this. In fact, for those of you who do know a little bit of linear algebra or have seen it because it's so big now because of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and that it's all linear algebra, right? It's all kind of the weights of your neural net. It's all tensor products. It's all tensors, and you can represent them in vector spaces. And so like one example, for example, in large language models, there's a vector space representing the whole model, and then you have a word like king, which is somewhere in that space. You can point to it. There's a vector that points to it. And then if you subtract man from king and add woman, or you subtract male and add female, you get queen in the vector space. So it's actually a spatial translation. You're subtracting man, adding woman, and turns out that's queen. So that's that's how the language model works. That's how it retrieves all of these meanings. The meanings are just vectors in this space. And why is it linear algebra? It's linear algebra because linearity is the preservation of structure. In calculus, which is, it's like linear algebra, but you can have curves, right? You have curvaceous functions. You've seen, if you have a little bit of calculus, you're talking about functions over time and differential equations and these kinds of things. And those are not linear. Those are nonlinear equations. And the point of linear algebra, which is actually also interesting for that distinction between semantics and syntax, because linear algebra is special. You have this algebraic aspect, which goes back to, I don't know, it goes back hundreds of years to at least the 8th century, when the Muslim mathematicians and were doing all this was kind of linear equations and quadratic equations were some of the first kind of algebraic work that happened in mathematics. This kind of this idea that you can line things up in a certain way, and it has a geometric aspect, but then you can count, and then you have, and then once you get to a point where you're good enough at manipulating these formula expressions of your geometry, you can manipulate them. Things like canceling like terms on either sides of an equation, or shifting things around, to bring out one value over all the others. So to bring out, the basics of algebra. You had all these rules that you can do. And so in linear algebra, you have these row operations, which are the first thing you do to a matrix. You take the matrix. So that's the other thing about linear algebra. It has both this matrix semantics and this vector space semantics, and they're both the same. They're both the same. They're represented. Their syntactic aspect is these rules. These rules and what do the rules do? The rules preserve structure through transformations. And so the row operations, when you're doing these row operations, the first thing you do to a matrix, you put it in a normal form. You're doing all these very abstract things to the matrix, just lining things up, putting things at the top, and just you're allowed to do certain things, and you just have to trust that the rules, but it's kind of very abstract when you're doing them until you see what the vector space is doing, which wasn't clear to these people. Like the people who developed these algebras didn't have the vector space representation. They had matrices, but the vector space representations come later, with the advent of dynamic mathematics, like Leibniz, and the time of the invention of calculus. And so you have, what you're doing with the row operations is you're just putting something. You're taking your vector space and you're squishing it and squeezing it while maintaining all of the relevant information, all of the relations between the vectors. And so what you're doing with the row operations is you're just rotating this vector space to make it fit with your own subjective, let's say, axes. So to make it more convenient to look at. So basically, you have this idea that that normalization is why are you putting all these things in a normal form? It's like taking a good look at something. It's like if you want to really take a good look, get a good angle, like rotate it into the right, put it in the right light, align it so that you can take a good look at it, and so that you can say things about it, so you can measure it, so you can compare it to other things. You're putting everything on. Say you would put two matrices on the same in the same space, so you can compare them. And that's basically what's happening. That's what I mean by, so is linearity means the preservation of structure. That's all it means. It just means you're preserving structure. And nonlinearity means that you lose the structure. So when we talk about chaos and, three-body problem and nonlinear systems, we're saying that you at a certain point, prediction breaks down, and so nonlinear equations can only be approximated. You can only approximate them to an arbitrary degree of precision, while linear reasoning or linear equations are predictable perfectly all the way through. Whatever you do to them, as long as you you follow these rules, you will preserve the structure through transformation. You always have the same, it's always still there. So that's what I had to say about that. Let's see if there's anything else. Yeah, so I already said this, states and effects are like the state. A state is like the top here, and then time is going in the other way. And so you have this, he calls them cups and caps, which is annoying because then if you change the time direction, which he did in this case, cups and caps doesn't make any sense, but a cup is like this shape and the cap is this shape. They mean different things if you switch the direction of the time direction. But a state, notice that a state is cap-like in this orientation. An effect is cup-like in this orientation. And then the meaning of a sentence is whatever happens in between states and effects. It's just the operator and basically you could take a big complex operation and reduce it into one operation, and it takes all these inputs and produces these outputs, So let's see. Yeah, that's it. Questions? Discussion? Please just turn on your mic and say something.
I'm not sure if this is really a question because I guess I still have to think through it. But in terms of the philosophical implications of this like linear structure that seemingly, or I guess linear logic that's able to be transported across like various domains, like it comes back to the question of whether there's some like underlying structure, I would say, like to the reality or the universe, or whether this is like an anthropocentric, like or a human-made construct that's being projected, and there happens to be some correspondence. So I guess interested to hear your thoughts on that.
That's a very good question. And it connects to, well, it connects to the way that Girard talks about it, which is, he talks about transcendental syntax, kind of evoking Kant, even though he doesn't, he's not, he reads the basic points, but he doesn't, it's not important for him to get, to read these things and to cite and reference all of these philosophers. He just takes what he needs and runs with it. But so this idea of this idea of a transcendental syntax is interesting because it's not, because we think of physics as what is, as like the stuff, the world out there, and then syntax is just what we need to discuss the world, or like to talk about it, or to express it, or describe it, and reason with it. But it does seem like it's a transcendental aspect. It's something about the way we evolved. We know that, for example, we have a language organ and other animals don't quite have it. Some higher primates can learn some vocabulary and even learn some basic grammar, but the healthy adult humans have this very particular capacity to use logic. Basically, it's transparent to the user. It's not really, no one's really, unless you're a logician, you're not really thinking about it, but we're constantly making use of these logical operators, and it's transparent. That's what he means by transparency. The Phantom of Transparency, which is one of his books, which I have here. It's yeah. So this is interesting duality. Is it the world? Is the universe made this way, or is it just the transcendental conditions of cognition? Is this syntax something that we evolved, and that it's so transparent to us we can't even see it, so like the idea is that by linear logic was kind of a way of seeing past, so like getting a glimpse of what is going on behind the scenes in these transcendental conditions. Then there's the related question, which was a question back when quantum physics and quantum logic was described, when von Neumann and Birkhoff presented quantum logic. The philosophical community was, especially Hilary Putnam wrote a series of papers on it, and one of them is a question of whether logic is empirical, whether logic changes given new empirical evidence. Now we've discovered this new quantum realm. Does that mean that our logic has to change? Does that mean that we were wrong about reasoning this way this whole time? Should we update? Is science telling us something about the way we should reason, like about the logic, the basic logic of our reasoning? And yeah, I don't really know where I stand on that, but I'm very interested in that question. This idea that also the mathematician who's responsible for homotopy type theory, Voevodsky, he said something very similar to that. Like he had this idea that that the universe is a computation, and that like there's new mathematics coming. Anyway, he had a lot of wild ideas behind it, but that there's that logic is not finished somehow, that it's still coming into being, that we'll see, we have to wait and see. And a lot of these proof theoretic style, like type theory, computer science perspective on things is definitely the, and also the intuitionistic mathematics in that whole field, because everything we've been talking about is deeply indebted to constructivism and intuitionism, Heiting and Brouwer and these guys. This idea that you need to be able to construct a proof. You need to actually compute it. You need to materially compute it, or else you don't have your proof. You need to demonstrate it and show it and exteriorize it. And that's very interesting, because we're getting into that topic of whether logic itself is empirical or not. I don't know. Any other questions? Anyone could be,
Well,
Yep.
I guess from from a sort of Hegelian perspective, it seems like you might be able to synthesize these 2 points via like the position of the observer as like this point of like conjugation between the transcendental, which is, I guess, sort of maybe internal to the observer, and then the condition of the real, which is sort of like external. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's a way of doing this in a Hegelian way. I would say actually there's this whole kind of reasoning around geometry of interaction really demands further kind of work on the relation between linear logic and kind of Robert Brandam's inferentialist account of semantic, and this normative production of this normative account of semantics, where it's a normative process and people are participating together, and it's very Hegelian, right? He claims that this is what Hegel was saying, but anyway, this is what he says. He is this idea that well, it's a Hegelian idea that the history is processing meaning somehow. Meaning will be revealed through this process, and in Brandam, it's very technical, and it's about these agents, something that and it's very related to what we looked at earlier with the with biology and these kinds of symbiotic, or like the hypercycle aspect. This idea that in game theory, for example, and actually John Maynard Smith, one of the authors of the biology one, he's instrumental in bringing game theory into evolutionary game theory. And so the idea is that you have when you have different players or different agents in a certain playing field, and the successful ones will tend to be, I have this gradient landscape in front of me, and the successful ones will climb a gradient, right? They'll climb a gradient, and then at some point there's a cutoff point, and only the ones who were above a certain threshold will survive. And that's maybe in the context of species, it would be a speciation. and in the context of so you have this, and it's also the same thing that happens in machine learning. You have this gradient ascent. Learning is becoming more fit at becoming more adapted, let's say, to an environment. And so there's this idea in game theory where there are all kinds of like equilibria that say if this, like the golden rule and the things like or the boy who cried wolf, these kinds of ideas that if you always lie, then no one's going to trust you. So there's a kind of if you want to survive for any time. Also, the prisoner dilemma. If you're honest and the other one's honest, then you might both, one of you will survive. There's higher chances that someone will survive. These kinds of equilibria, or like these kinds of structures that naturally occur within the game theoretic perspective. So it says something like, in certain cases, cooperation is beneficial and provides a survival advantage. So you have that kind of normativity built in, where you say someone infers this is this is a table, this is a chair, this is the so let's go back to for the emergence of language, the very, very early. So the idea is that the first language emerged from animal calls. So you have like chimpanzees, when they find food, they'll make a certain call, and they're telling their community that we've got some food over here, come and have some, there's different calls for different things, right? And there's this kind of repetition of the idea of the molecular idea of rightness and wrongness, or truth and falsehood, that occurs at the chemical level, let's say, with atoms can bond together in this way but not in another way, and all these kinds of things. There's this similar idea that happens at the emergence of language, and this is language. This is proto-language. It's not language proper, because there are no objects and subjects. There are just these calls that are uttered in certain situations. And you can either utter that call in the right situation, or you can utter it in the wrong situation. And probably your parents will correct you if you did for example, if you did the food call when there was no food, you're the boy who cried wolf, and people won't believe you anymore. So you better do the right sound. You better say the right call in the right situation, right? And so this language kind of just emerges out of these kinds of things. And then it becomes, so then you have a call for this, a call for that, and then eventually you have a word for each noun in the environment. It just keeps growing, because all of a sudden you realize it's very useful to be able to name things. And then a bit later on, you have verbs that attach themselves. So you have this kind of very simple, it's not even grammar yet, still proto-language, but you have a kind of noun and a process, a verb or something. You have a thing and a change of the thing. And then you have transitive verbs that emerge between these nouns, these noun words. And it grows like that, all kind of tied together around this inferential normative cooperation, let's say, or this hypercycle. We could relate it to a hypercycle, this kind of idea that it's cooperatively beneficial to the community if everyone just gets in line and calls a table and a chair, and rather than. So that's kind of what Brandon does, right? He's saying, well, don't worry. He says no to Wittgenstein. he says all that stuff, Wittgenstein doubting that our words mean anything because they're just utterances and not how do you know whether it's, you know, foundationalism doesn't work, therefore nothing means anything, you might as well not even try to figure it out. And Brandom says, no, don't worry, it all makes sense because eventually it all points down, and that's the spirit of trust, right? You can trust that semantics makes sense. That semantics holds, that there is a proper semantics behind it. Even if we can't specify it, we can't go down. And that's kind of an issue I have with Brandom because I think in linear logic, you have a similar aspect, this game theoretic, there's game semantics, this ludics on one side, but that's very simple, and geometry of interaction, which is more a richer idea. But you have a very close relationship with science, quantum physics, with the empirical, and naturalism, physicalism, you know? And Brandon doesn't have that. He resists that at every turn. He does not want to say that physics is fundamental. He does not want to say that, because normativity for him is even more fundamental, because everything we end up saying about the world is necessarily within this kind of normative cauldron that we evolve in. So, and that's where I prefer to go in the direction of linear logic, because I feel like it's motivated. It like the fact that it allows us to describe all these subtle things in quantum physics and language and computation for me, and has this normative interpretation. It means that for me, it's very, very promising, very interesting direction. Anyone else?
Well, I guess I had one last
Yeah.
question, but
Go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, I guess sort of in line with this, you mentioned how like there's, I mean, in the context of the animal calls, how like if there's an individual that does not make the correct call at the right time, then that can result in some like upsetting of both like the functionality and I guess like the the norms of whatever semantic space. But I think on a broader level too, like this I guess what I would call the philosophy of exception, where there's always something that's sort of not included or is like the minority. And so how that impacts your ontology and your epistemology and your ethics as well. So I guess I don't know if you're. I would also be
Yeah.
interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, I don't know that I take it up to an ethical. I don't think I can take it up to a political or ethical level. But there is this question about, in evolution you have variation. Actually, that's what I had this whole section here on these different ways of representing evolution. You have the autocatalysis equation, which is linear enough, and the a plus b implies two b's, right? But then you have the what do you call them? Is it called the rate equations or something? The amounts of the different substances involved in the autocatalysis, that's nonlinear. And in the hypercycle equation is a nonlinear equation. It's a differential equation. All of them are. The replicator equation in evolutionary game theory is also a differential equation. So you have nonlinearity in as soon as you're talking about time. So you have this feedback process, but it means that there's something new coming in. There is some newness and yet stability through the newness somehow, right? The persistence through change. And so that newness is nonlinear, you know, that. And so in biology, you also have this idea that you have structural preservation, but in order to evolve, you need to mutate some amount of the time. So there needs to be an error. You need to mutate a certain part of the time. And the reason you do is because if you don't, when you can have if there's a drastic change in the environment, then the species will not have enough variational gene variations and in order to make it through the evolutionary bottleneck or whatever. That's the kind of basic example. Another example is this one, the free energy principle. I think I mentioned it earlier. At every level of especially biology, you can have this idea of this there is an agent, and it's just kind of twofold. This agent trying to make predictions about the world, and as those predictions fail, let's say, you update the predictions. It's like a Bayesian algorithm, right? You predict, make a mistake, you change your expectations. And that too is nonlinear. So yeah, I understand this idea coming from, especially from a Deleuzian background, this idea that difference, you need that everything, you need that difference and that chaos, let's call it, to get things going, for things to change and move and whatnot. But I think that's what we still need to really understand is how structure is preserved, because life is, at least from, there's a perspective in language where you're trying to get it right, unless you're doing poetry or art or something, but there's this idea that perhaps because of this inferential, this normative bond that that ties us all together, you want to get it right. And from the say the point of view of the model of evolution of the organism from the inside, I know I said you don't want to talk about things teleologically, but it does seem that if you were to attribute a goal to the living cell or to the organism or to the species or to the genes themselves, the selfish genes, it is to persist and to continue to, like, this is a selfish aspect to it. And the selfish aspect is somehow connected to that structural preservation, the linearity of it. The selfish aspect, the fact that it is reproduced. We're reproducing the same structure, the exact same structure each time. We're trying to, at least, so no organism sets out to mutate. It sets out to copy and replicate. And the mutation is an artifact, let's say. But in a lot of these models, the two are the same. They're kind of together. There's variation, and there's variation coming in, and structural preservation, repetition, replication. So yeah, I mean, I think that's where it stands right now. We have to kind of figure out where all of these different aspects, how they fit together, and what is the right way to model things. There's so many different ways that you can look at things and cut it up and to think and then model it with these tools and resources, that there's no kind of smoking gun kind of, that's, you know, that's what it is. And, but it's interesting nonetheless, right? I'd love to continue this because there's so much more to say, and this whole aspect on whether logic is empirical is super interesting, and the whole Brandom thing is super interesting. We could go deeper into those things too, but you know, there's a lot of information to take on when you go into linear logic. It's such an unintuitive, like, just a whole other world, and there's so much in there. I only just scratched the surface, right? There's anyway, but yeah, it was great to share some of it with you, and do it again sometime.